Okay, everybody, so I will make a start there. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming to the final seminar this semester. So I'll hand over to Lisa, who's going to introduce Jim, who's coming to speak to us.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jim Harris. Jim is a professor of environmental technology based at Cranfield University at the Cranfield Environment Center. Jim is a systems ecologist. He's interested in system complexity, function, emergent properties, particularly resilience. His research is very broad, it's fair to say, but it's mainly related to ecological restoration with a focus on soil health and soil microbial ecology in relation to ecosystem process. He can study this across a range of land uses, from natural systems to urban and agricultural land uses. And his work has also influenced policy development at national and international levels. So, for example, he's been lead author in the Research Report on Land Degradation and Restoration. And he's also a past chair of the International Society for Ecological Restoration. And several of us have been collaborating with Jim for a few years on the Restoring Resilient Ecosystems project that I think I mentioned today. And yeah, today we're going to be listening to Jim talk about complexity, resilience, and restoring forwards. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thanks, Elise. Thanks for inviting me. And thanks, everyone, for coming along. So I've got quite a few slides to get through. So some of this is going to be blinking, you'll miss it. But hopefully I'm going to illustrate quite a bit of journey that I've been on over the years, looking at ecosystems and restoring them. And my first degree was really in plant biochemistry, but as a result of working into the wrong research office at British Coal, I ended up as a soil microbiologist, doing my PhD on the microbiology of topsoil stores. And from that, I started to think about the discipline of soil microbial ecology, but how biochemistry plays into that, and then how systems work. So that's really where I'm coming from. We've got some questions that are posed at the moment with increasingly complex dynamics of our weather system. How are we going to translate that into any kind of effective advice and guidance for setting policy and guidelines? How are we going to do that? At what level can we look at systems and make recommendations about how we should be measuring and managing things going forward? And that is critically important. How are we going to do that? The world is increasingly variable, increasingly complex in the interaction between nature and society. Can we use some of these process-based dynamic measures to cope with that, but still reflect ecological integrity of the system? And that term, ecological integrity, is a really important one. And how are we going to work that into what it means for people's livelihoods in conservation and restoration? So the principal issue that we've got is restoration in the old sense is a term that can limit what we can do. So I'm going to try and put in context how I think we can move forward here. And in this context of the moves being biophysical envelope. Now, of course, we know there are all kinds of models out there of how climate should be and have been historically, but we know that that's changing. And we know that we can make models based on that changing bioclimatic envelope to make predictions about what might go where. So this is work of Tom Oliver, published back in 2016. They looked at a huge range of butterfly species, and this looks at the three major scenarios. And in this one, they've picked one apart, one species that they've looked at. And they're kind of showing, well, it's kind of the blue areas, the declines, they're much, much bigger than the areas of potential increase. But that's pretty much a straightforward north-south movement, but there's some restrictions in how quickly that can happen. But it's not just the climate now that's having an impact. So I'm not bringing you a simpler picture, it's more complex, and it gets more and more complex. Work just out this last week has looked at the impact of nitrogen deposition in Europe on the movement of species, and this is quite remarkable. There are some places, especially around, if we look in the Netherlands and parts of Italy, where nitrogen deposition, in some places it's 40 kilograms of nitrogen as nitrogen per hectare per annum. That's an incredible rate of nitrogen addition to a system. And the consequence of that has been that the rate of species shifting from east to west is now 2 to 2.5 times faster than species moving south to north. So this is something that hasn't really gained much attention up to now. And this sort of meta-analysis is pointing to the fact that this is something that might overwhelm some of our thinking around what we should be moving where. And of course, with the correlation, and this isn't north, south, east, west diagram, I have berated the authors for not putting that on their figures. It's also, there's extinctions going on in the east that aren't necessarily being picked up by migrations from further east. So here we can see that this huge signal of nitrogen in the west-east rate of movement and its extinction. So that's another factor to bring in. And of course, just to add to the complication, we see lots of models where by simply looking at a shifting bioclimatic envelope, we say, well, these species will move north, particularly around plant species and animal species, but the underlying substrate, the soils, are hugely different from one place to another. So I've just picked two. One is pH, that's incredibly important. It's great, isn't it, where you've got the whole of Norway is pH 5.8, 65.8. I don't think that's true. But the soil surveys that are available show that there's a huge range in pHs right down to 2.7. And simple south-north movements based on that change in bioclimatic envelope are not going to be straightforward, because you've got soils that have got quite a bit of buffering capacity in them, won't be changing to suit particular species in the way that those species are fitted for a niche based on different soil substrates. So, and I've just put up the percentage sand. Again, that's a huge impact on soil water availability. So I hope that's cheered everyone up. So what this means is, and this is some sort of, a lot of this stuff is conceptual, because I think you have to think at that level to then start to drill down to detail and get actual examples. Imagine we've got two sets of regime. We've got the conditions of the system, the adversity of the regime, and anyone will recognise this as Phil Grimes' idea of stress and disturbance playing major roles in determining niche availability. So we've got an adversity regime and we've got a disturbance regime. And what happens under a system of an unchanging environment, where we get changes over decadal and centennial time spans, and they move backwards and forwards, then these niches, the potential niche that's available, moves about. And you can imagine a forest mosaic, and as different things happen, that you get secondary succession as fires and droughts and floods happen. So then you've got niches available in a large mosaic for these different species to actually be expressed in a vegetative form, and animals can move about to occupy the niches that suit them. The problem is that what we've been doing is locking some of those sites that are of particular interest, and they might be designated as protected areas, SSSIs, etc. And sometimes we're locking them into a conservation regime, which means that what's happening is not going to really favour those groups of species that were first designated for a site. The consequence of that, of course, is that those assemblages and the species within them may no longer be able to resist the change that's going on. So that, however, offers the potential that new niches will be possible under the new climatic regime. And we need to be thinking about, well, what is it that can be done in places that we value highly for nature that might not necessarily look like the nature that was there before 100%, as an additional tool to work with. And the reason that we need to think about this is this idea that we've been, up until we started to roll these changes to the environment, that species interaction really were in this sort of red queen mode. Competition, predation, and other biotic factors were really shaping the ecosystems locally because they were more or less stable overall, and they were the things that were shaping those communities. And now we're moving into this Court Jester scenario where extrinsic factors, climate, oceanographic effects, even tectonic effects would normally take over thousands of millions of years, but because of we've forced these changes in the climate, we're moving rapidly into that kind of environment, certainly with regard to climatic factors and oceanographic factors increasing. Okay, there is some cheer to be had later on. I mean, you're just going to have to hold your breaths. So when you say the word restoration, very often we get this obscure object of desire, an imagined and an unknowable past, because one, it's very difficult to interrogate the past. And so in fact, what happens is people imagine what it was like, or they get a set of data from a very particular field and say, well, it was like that. Well, we don't actually know if it was like that or not. So that's a difficulty. And our problem is that if we are making decisions based on we want to go backwards, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, I think. We need to be moving forwards. Right, what's happening now? No?
Wiggle the mouse back.
Wiggle the mouse. Right, let's try
On the bottom.
there we are. Brilliant. So, heroic work done by John Wardwell many years ago to produce this description of vegetations, assemblages around particular habitat types. Amazing piece of work, but he always said that these species lists were a description, not a prescription. But in many places, they are being taken as a prescription for management. We've got to have this represented, that represented in these proportions. And sometimes that can be taken just too far. There are places where managers are flexible and understand what's going on. In other places, it's not so easy to make through that sort of idea and that kind of thinking. So we get this, which of course you will all immediately recognise as an ancient woodland. It's lacking a big factor here called time. I'm not going to talk much about biodiversity again. In fact, I'm not going to talk at all about that because I'd be here for several hours. The notion that this, being 10% bigger than the piece of ancient woodland that it's replaced, is a replacement, is, what's the most politic word I can use? Questionable, perhaps. And part of the problem is that we've become wedded to standards rather than principles. An idea or a thing used as a measure, norm, or model in comparative evaluations as opposed to principles, a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behaviour. And I think that's really, really important. If we keep imposing standards around a number or a series of numbers or a list of species, we're going to find, I mean, all of the standards that I've been aware of in and outside of ecology are at least 5, usually 10, and often 20 years out of date behind the science. So we need to think hard about how can we make things flexible and adaptable. We've now got a global biodiversity standard. We've got principles and standards for ecological restoration. I worked with the Canadian government on this document, which I think allows that kind of flexibility because it's based on principles and guidelines rather than you will do this in this situation. So, the reason for this, you're all wondering what this fig leaf's about, aren't you? Yeah, so this is to avoid triggering anyone. So we might have in our mind the idea of a perfect system. Okay, this is what we're aiming for. This is the ideal of what the system looks like. However, because our understanding of systems are complex in certain ways, but actually quite rudimentary in others, what we often end up with in a design for conservation or restoration, something that is less than high fidelity in terms of describing that system. And then having designed it, we've then got to implement it. And can we get the right things in the right condition, with the right provenance? And you can end up with an implementation which is absolutely dreadful. At least I won the competition. So we've got a moving target. If we took, so traditionally restoration, which I've been working in about 40 years, the idea was very much there's been a perturbation of some sort of degradation and you've simply got to go back. Well, if we hadn't intervened with this degradation, the original system probably would have changed anyway. And in some cases, going back to systems that have been preserved over several hundred years. So perhaps we should, and I got the notion of restoring forwards from Keith Bowers, who set up and has established this amazing consultancy in North America called Biohabitats, the idea of restoring forwards. And also I want to make the case for novel ecosystems might be part of the palette of potential means of management that we want to consider. And that's why I think that we need to be, in addition to all of the tools and techniques that we've got, thinking about system level approaches for measurement and management of systems. So we have this project called REST-RECO, Restoring Resilient Ecosystems, and the team here at Stirling are part of that NERC-funded project along with UKCEH. And we're looking to look for a new paradigm for goal seeking. So it goes beyond reference systems, is agnostic to prior assumptions of intactness, integrity, and system health. And we're looking at biodiversity, architecture, and modern functionality. And we need to identify determinants and measures of complexity that take us to where we want to be in terms of understanding what the emergent properties of those systems are. And my particular focus is on resilience across a range of trophic levels. So we're working across all kind of levels. I mean, underlying this, there's a philosophical question to ask, which is, are ecosystems actually ecosystems? And that's a pretty profound question, and quite a troubling one if you're trying to protect ecosystem function. So this is the basic starting point. We've got these physical, biological, and chemical characteristics of systems that interact, that work together and produce complexity. That complexity produces function, and those functions produce an emergent property or a suite of emergent properties. And our question is, can we look for the way in which those assembled components, the complexity they exhibit, and the functions they exhibit in any way predict emergent properties that we might be keen to secure in a restored system. And that's what we're trying to link together, because if we just look at the components without looking at the whole system, we're going to miss that system property. Okay, so can we look at the whole system whilst also examining all those components? Can we tie those together in any way? Can we do something that will allow us to give us a picture that will add to the tools available for us to make sensible decision making about measurement and management for conservation and restoration? One of the other things that we have to be really aware of is the importance of scale. And the reason for that is, imagine you've got a series of interacting components in an ecosystem. If you just look at that scale, and this might be a group of species, it might be just looking at the soil compartment, you'll get some indications of what's happening in the system at that particular compartment. And therefore you might observe a little bit of complexity, but you're not going to detect any emergent property, because the emergent properties are a system characteristic. They're not the characteristics of the individual components. As you go up the scale, you can see more of the system and you can see more of the complexity. But again, you're not really going to detect emergence until you look at the whole system. We have to ask ourselves, are we looking at a system, or are we looking at part of the system? You might not be. If you can't detect an emergent property, you're either you're not looking at the right thing, you're not looking at the right scale, or it's not a system. So what we're trying to do is pull together, looking at compositional and structural components. There are many things that we're looking at. We're looking at invertebrates, vegetation, microbial components, with system type characteristics like acoustics, tree data, remote sensing, with the idea of, can we then come up with these complexity measurements for different components? Can we then look at what they mean in terms of relationships between complexity and function? And then going beyond that, is there some way of putting all those together into one metric to bind them all? So that's really what the program is about. Can we come up with this metric we can use in addition to all the other things that we already measure and manage? And we're also cognizant that we need to think about the scale, local scale, landscape scale, from low to high complexity. And that's what we've sought to do. I think we drew this one, at least, if I'm not mistaken, which is in our original sort of position paper in ecography a couple of years back. So we tried to select a range of sites. We've looked at broadleaf and mixed woodland in Scotland and in England. We looked at short grasslands, and we've also looked at their starting points, whether they were post-industrial or post-agricultural. You could argue that these are all post-industrial, depending on what kind of agriculture's taken place on the land beforehand. And from that, we're starting to draw out an indication of what these antecedent conditions impact has been on what we've found. In part, this has informed some earlier work that I've been doing with colleagues in the Netherlands, where we looked at, in the Netherlands, one of the main approaches has been to strip off the top 40 centimetres of farmed soil, often on very sandy substrates, to remove virtually all of the nutrients and then leave it very much build the field and they will come type of approach. And we found there, actually, if you introduce things like hay and sod, which is earth, clumps of earth, you can actually start to increase the complexity of the system and the relationships and connections between plant taxa and fungal taxa. This is tied in with research which shows that actually the soil microbial community can have a great deal of influence in driving vegetation assemblage. Jasper Woods and others and Wim van der Putten have worked, and we found it in our work also. So there is a way in which you can kind of increase complexity by intervention. In other places, and this is part of our Resrico work, we're already finding some really interesting interactions that you might not expect. So this is plant species richness along a gradient, and the red are SSSI grasslands, and the yellow are NEP, wildland. So this rewilding, poster child of rewilding, amazing stuff that they've been doing there. And what we found is that actually the pollinators, because the nectar and pollen resources are so abundant, are actually starting to produce very species-rich pollinator groups. This is interesting because they have always said their aim is to produce emergent properties. They don't know what's going to emerge, but the idea is to let the animals manage the system and let's see what happens. So an extraordinary experiment. So that takes me to one of the things we've been interested in for quite a while, in terms of, well, what is the emergent property that we could use to indicate whether this is a system and whether it's functioning as a system. And that's when we've got interested in resilience and critical slowing down. Resilience, because that's something we're going to need to build into systems with this changing, this abruptly changing bioclimatic envelope. So taken very simply, if we look at an ecosystem function or state, a resistant system is one which will continue resisting a perturbation until it collapses. A resilient system will bounce back after a particular set of perturbations. And it's important to say here, again, the level at which you're examining that function is incredibly important, because you need to be able to determine whether this is a whole system response or you're just looking at part of it. Because it's possible that you can get to a point where you tip into an alternative state. And this is something that's been solved for quite a number of years. And of course, this is very much a sort of an engineering resilience type view that, well, what we want is the system to go back exactly the way it was before. And my argument would be, actually, what we want it to do is to be as biodiverse as it was before, as complex in its functions and architecture as it was before, but not necessarily with the same species. And this is work from Folkert. Well, they try to explain this in terms of sort of cup and ball type analogies of stability in systems and stable states, where they said that in a system that's in a basin of attraction, it's very stable. We'll find that there's no correlation between perturbation events. The variance between different events doesn't vary, or not increasing variance. Whereas in a system that's close to transition, you will start to get increased variance after perturbations, and you'll get a correlation between perturbation events in terms of whatever the system probably is you're measuring. And this is used in really diverse fields. This is used in cardiology to look at heart state and the effects of challenge. It's used in stock market analysis. It's used in traffic analysis. So it's quite, it's quite an established systems type view. And can we use this in what we're interested in? And a good way to think about this is that our colleague Stanji has come up with this analogy, which is quite useful. Imagine you've got a very flat piece of motorway in front of you. It's brand new. All the surfaces are great, except for every so often you've put a speed bump in. You've put them on regular intervals. So that's where your perturbation is going to occur. And you get into a 1970s clunker Cadillac and you put your foot down. And what happens is the Cadillac hits the first bump and starts to do this. And then it hits the second one and it starts to do that. And then it hits the third one and it falls to pieces. Kapow. You're a brand new Mercedes Jeep and it hits the first one, clonk, second, clonk, clonk. And the reason for that is that the Cadillac remembers the previous perturbation. That perturbation is still resonating in the system when it hits the next disturbance. Whereas the Mercedes has forgotten the last one. It's recovered back to its previous state, and the next one as if that one had never happened. So that's where we were starting to look at this. And so we've got Landsat imagery from the last 20 plus years. We've been looking at NDVI and putting this up against what we know in the drought record from those sites, from a variety of sites. We've done this looking at Cosmos sites, and then we're going to apply it to Resrico sites. And this is Will Rust and Dan Sims, who are part of the project. And what they found was that over the sort of 20-year period of Landsat, they were looking at NDVI, and then they were looking at this, could they find this autocorrelation? And so the initial work that they did, where they had to denoise the system, they found that, yeah, we were starting to get more autocorrelation from about 2015, 2016. This is just one site. We started off just looking at 6 of the children's sites that we were working on. We had discussions with various people, and we said we found them in all 6 sites. And someone said, well, you've only looked at 6 sites. And I said, well, what's the chance we've happened to pick the only 6 in the whole UK that are exhibiting this? Since then, we've found sites that haven't exhibited this, but that's a more complex part of the story that we'll get to at one point. Since then, they've taken this work and have looked in greater detail at there are several things that had to be done. One of the biggest problems with things like Landsat imagery is cloud cover. They've looked at cloud cover, they've denoised it for that, for the changes and degradation in the sensors of the satellite, changes in atmospheric quality. They've taken all of that out and they've produced this approach called sweep. Because we wanted to think about, could you use this to triage sites to say, where do we want to intervene first? So using this cup and ball analogy, can we say, well, this is a resilient system, but this system appears to be unstable and is heading for collapse. And of course, the big example that we're aware of in the past couple of years is what's happened over in Loch Ness, where it suddenly transitioned from this lovely clear, largest surface body of fresh water in the UK to this horrible green pea soup. Is there a way where we can use this kind of approach to get to this understanding of cup and ball? So what they did after they've done this denoising, plotted this system resilience by looking at the autocorrelation, the mean, and then they've actually worked out what the energy states of these systems are. And if you now look, so on the left, you're going to see the dotted red line moving from the past to the present, and on the right you'll see what's happening to that energy potential state. And as time goes by, this ball that's being violently shaken by drought is moving about in this higher energy state. And then we get to around about 2018, 2019, when there was a significant drought event. It then teeters on this brink of the cup and then collapses into this lower energy state. And this means that we've got a system where the NDVI might be telling you something, but actually, if you then look at the energy states and what's going on, it looks like it's actually collapsed into a lower state. This is one site. We've now got that for all the sites across the cosmos, sites that we looked at. Can we start to use that perhaps as an additional tool to make decisions about where are we in terms of restoration, which of our restorations and existing sites of conservation aren't exhibiting any kind of transfer soon, or are there areas where we need to think? Because what we could do with this is, well, I mean, it's just a neat animation, isn't it? I mean, that's great. How are we going to use this? We could say, is the system exhibiting signs of critical slowing down? Well, yes, it looks like it's starting to get to that point where it's going to collapse. We need to urgently intervene. No, it isn't. Is it already in that alternative state? So it might be stable simply because it's fallen over. If it is it really difficult to get it back? No, we can do some heroic restoration to try and get it back into that higher state. If it isn't, are there non-historical analogues we might want to consider as a way of restoring ecosystem function and structure and diversity? And if not, then we just need to monitor and maintain and just keep looking. And the thing is, for satellite technology, that's becoming easier and easier and cheaper to do. And we might end up with, obviously, this is completely made up, this is net, but we might be able to put some kind of mosaic over systems to say, well, this is where we need to be, this is where we need to be acting now, and this is where we need to keep our eye on it. And this is, we think this is okay, and we carry on. Again, it's not a substitute, it's simply a way of trying to think about the whole picture. So we might want to think about 3 timescales, reactive resiliency, sort of dealing with immediate threats. We've got maybe a disease threat or a change in oxygen status like we're seeing in Lognay. Adjustive resiliency, which we're kind of thinking about now, ecosystems are threatened but not yet at this close to collapse point, and then provident resiliency, and that's building buffering into the system. And Hannah Weiss and the rest of us put this idea of what the kind of interventions. Now we're quite good at that middle one in terms of restoration of wetlands and areas like that, but we do need to think about the bigger scale in terms of long term, because buffering is an essential part of secure resilience, and without building and allowing buffering capacity in a system, we end up with a system that's just a series of joined up single points of failure. So this is what on earth is he doing 4 candles up there? So when I was a lad, which is quite a long time ago, at the corner of our Victorian terrace, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's like the 15 minutes sitting. We had a little East End set of Victorian terraced housing. We were in a split house. We were at the flat upstairs. We had a couple of general stores. We had a laundrette, a greengrocers. We had a dairy. We had an off license, and we had a general hardware store. And that hardware store had every kind of fitting and fixture and bolt and screw and pipe that you could ever want. So the buffering in this particular place is the variety of information that's available in that shop. You can go to a modern hardware store like B&Q, and there is a very narrow range of components available to you. You cannot get a 3/4 inch iron nut, I discovered last week, to put on your Victorian gas pipe. You can't find one. What do? The advice is have it ripped out and put a new central heating system in. Okay? So we need to be thinking about that. And novel ecosystems are ecosystems that, by virtue of human influence, and this is climatic change principally, although we need to think about some of those other soil changes that we wrought, different from those that prevailed historically, and have a tendency to self-organize. That's the important thing, that they can self-organize. Eric Higgs and others have put together sort of what the smorgasbord of these kind of things might be, whether you're centered on the ecosystem, whether you're human-centric, self-assembled on the left here, in green, design systems in blue, composition, function, and we have a number of ways in which we can look at moving from historical to green infrastructure and potential nature-based solutions. So there's been a lot of thinking about how we might want to do this. This is a flowchart we came up with, how you would help to make those decisions. I won't go into detail on this. It's just in conclusion, we do need to consider that in certain circumstances, we might want to be playing the same play, but have different actors carrying out that ecosystem function, delivering beauty, delivering natural places that self-organize for the future. We had something in the niche last month on prolific systems, and we thought we might want to take a look at. So if you have me, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Jim, for a great talk, and yeah, keeping the time as well. So didn't even need the warning for time. So there you go. Yeah, that's one of these. Do you have any questions? So those on Teams, you can either put up your hand or put some in the chat, but I give privilege to those that make it in. So any questions for Jim? Yep.
Thanks, Jim. That was fascinating. You sort of posed a slightly rhetorical question in the middle about our ecosystems.
Yeah.
Say a bit more about that.
So we do have to ask, are they actually systems? Or have we labelled a group of organisms that appear to be centred around a set of niches expressed as what we would call a forest? Is that actually a system? Or is it simply a collection of similar organisms in a place controlled by extrinsic factors such as soils and climate? Is it actually showing that those are linked and exhibiting these kind of system level properties? Because that's quite an important, I mean, what we've just done with the satellite data might suggest that actually they are, and we need to, and that's something that we need to think about when what we're trying to do is not simply, although we've got to be planting trees in certain places, but the system's properties might take a long time to exhibit. So that's why I've asked that question: are they systems? Are we looking at the right scale? Is the scale of a 20-hectare plantation at right scales, or do we have to look at the whole catchment? Well, my starting point would always be the hydrological catchment, but because of the power of hydrology in terms of delivering underlying conditions.
So yeah, so that kind of implies a degree of diversity within the ecosystem that might be beyond, for example, woodland, or it would have to be a mosaic of open canopy, the rest of that stuff, as well as the trees.
Yeah, sort of a fluid mosaic shifting about in response to perturbations, different types of what you would call a successional stage from newly open space. Of course, animals are very important in that, making those big spaces. We know the impact of things like elephants in tropical systems, how important they are for structuring canopies and below canopy plants, etc. And do we mimic that, or do we put the animals back? Which is what they're doing at net, of course. Let the animals sort them out.
So just one final thing then. So would that be your kind of the way you would distinguish between a habitat and an ecosystem would be on that point of emergence?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what we can do. I think there's lots of way of getting at it. So part of the work that Elise and Kirsty up here are doing is looking at bioacoustic signals and how important they might be in providing an indication of how complex your system is. I'm interested in the smell of soils. What does that tell us about the state of the below ground system? What about bioacoustics underground? What does that tell us about the complexity of the system? And because the rate at which data gathering and collection and analysis is speeding up almost geometrically now, with using AI to try and get to some of these fundamentals, I think we're in a place where we can come up with some pretty reasonable attempts at summarising that complexity and those emergent properties.
Any other questions? So we'll go for Alan and then.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Given most of the examples you gave are habitat restoration, lakes, woodland, grasslands, are we any good at systems restoration and can we do better?
Right, okay, so this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it's not. The answer is I don't know, because we've not really looked at it like that before. And I think that there are ways in which we can say, looking at, for example, nitrates in surface waters, we can pretty sure that we haven't been very good at restoring systems because they're still leaking nutrients. So ergo, we haven't been restoring them as mature systems. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing those things in surface waters. We wouldn't see, you know, how many times after a flood you see a river that's just brown because half of the catchment soil is in the river. So we've not done the job. On the other hand, you can find small catchments where restoration has gone ahead, and even after a flood, the water is still running clear. And of course, if you reintroduce beaver, that helps. At what point do I have to leave the room if I say wolves and bears?
And I think that's a different audience you have to leave the room for.
Okay, but you know that they can have a role in structuring systems and ecosystems, and I know there's all kinds of issues there. But I talk to my students from all over Europe, saying who's in a country that's got a high population of wolves and bears. Get lots of people who have. I said, who's ever seen one? Never seen one. Who's ever heard one? I heard a wolf last year, you know, howling. So I don't know. It's a difficult question. Of course, it's any land management system, and goodness knows we've seen that yesterday, haven't we, with what's been happening with changes in inheritance tax.
Yeah, so the NDVI setting percentage should be a critical slowdown, and so that's possible what it is trying to transition to a different state. Right? So do you have any idea what state is transitioning to, like what this license could look like?
Well, okay, so this is something that we'd hope to get when we fit that to the data that we've got from the REST RECAP sites to try and understand that. And it may be that they don't look much different floristically at the moment, but there might be some underlying processes going on that have changed to make them very vulnerable. So it would be really convenient if we went to those sites and found that the flora's changed completely or the invertebrates have changed completely, but there's probably lag of time in that. And we're only talking about 2018, 2019 for that site when the change occurred. So there's probably some lag time in what's going to be appearing over the next few years before the underlying system constraint mechanisms really start to kick in.
Time for one more question.
Because you said that, for example, looking at the circulation of water, how water deficits, I wonder how much of what you said is translatable to, for example, marine environments, where there's like it's harder to kind of set those boundaries, right?
Yeah, that's why I work in terrestrial systems. It's really hard because everything's connected to everything else. Yeah. But there should be properties that we could look at in those. I mean, we're seeing some big changes in marine systems, aren't we? But we are seeing where certain efforts in certain places are starting to bring back some system properties in marine systems. It's not my area of expertise by any way, but certainly this kind of thinking I've seen happening.
So I have one final question. It's come on Teams. You can read it there. But I'll read it out. Do we need a complete rethink of conservation designations? For example, SSSIs, NNRs, that aim to keep a system in a defined and perceived to be desired state. And how would we go about designing sites for forward-thinking nature recovery instead? So you can answer that, and then yeah, you go. So.
When my answers
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Sarah. Yeah, no, to the first part of that, we really do need to think about. It's not necessary that you should abandon the SSSI as a designation. It's just what is that designation characterised by, which I think is the issue. That if you can sort of say, well, yeah, there's some species things going on, but there are some system characteristics that we need to bear in mind when we're doing this kind of thing. And for forward-thinking nature recovery, it's diversity, I think, and functional diversity, architectural diversity that's going to be important.
Thank you very much. So we're now at just coming for 5:02, so I think we'll probably call it to a close. So just to thank Jim, who's around, I think, for the rest of this afternoon anyway, meetings and stuff. But if you want to come and have a chat with Jim, come. So thank you very much, Jim. Very much.